Let me begin with something simple and uncomfortable. At 101 years old, I no longer have the luxury of pretending that time is generous. It is not. It is precise. It is selective. And it remembers every moment you hesitated when life quietly asked you to be brave. So I want to ask you a question before you settle into listening. When was the last time you almost became a different person and then didn't? Not in some dramatic, cinematic way. I mean the quiet turning points. The phone call you rehearsed but never made. The apology you held in your throat until it hardened into distance. The dream you labeled unrealistic so you could keep living safely inside a smaller life. I spent 42 years sitting behind a wooden desk in a guidance office that smelled faintly of chalk dust and winter coats. Teenagers came to me believing they were asking about colleges and careers. But what they were really asking was permission to trust their own instincts. I watched them stand on invisible thresholds every single day. Some stepped forward. Many stepped back and called that retreat maturity. If you live long enough, you begin to see a pattern. The regrets that echo the loudest are rarely about reckless things you did. They are about the courageous things you almost did, the love you nearly confessed, the truth you almost allowed to reshape your life, the risks you softened into polite compromises. So, I want to offer you 10 hard truths. Not cruel truths, not cynical truths, just honest ones. The kind that arrive slowly through decades of watching people struggle and through the quieter decades of watching yourself make the same mistakes you warned others about. The first truth is this. The stories you tell about your past are often edited for emotional comfort rather than factual clarity. Memory is not a recording device. It is a painter. It softens sharp edges. It rearranges scenes. It allows you to believe you chose a path that you were actually too afraid to question. I have done this more times than I can count. The second truth follows close behind. The people who love you are not mind readers. Waiting for them to intuit your needs is a subtle form of self-abandonment. I spent years feeling unseen in a marriage that was, in fact, full of kindness. The problem was not absence of love. The problem was my silence. If you are listening carefully, you may already recognize yourself in these words. That is not an accident. Human lives, for all their surface differences, tend to follow similar emotional blueprints: fear of rejection, desire for approval, the quiet hope that someday conditions will align perfectly and courage will feel effortless. It rarely does. So stay with me. These truths will not solve your life in an hour, but they may help you see it more clearly. And clarity, I have learned, is often the beginning of freedom. The third truth is one that most people recognize in their bodies long before they acknowledge it in their minds. Your body is speaking to you right now, and you are negotiating with its warnings, as if they were optional suggestions. At 101, I can tell you with complete certainty that the body is not dramatic. It is methodical. It whispers first. It repeats itself. And only when ignored does it begin to shout. In my late 50s, I developed a fatigue that felt strangely personal, as though exhaustion had chosen me as its residence. I attributed it to workload, to aging parents, to the 1,000 reasonable explanations that allowed me to postpone investigation. It was easier to be busy than to be attentive. Months later, when a routine test revealed a condition that required immediate intervention, the doctor said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Your body had been asking you for help for a long time. You simply declined the invitation." Most people think catastrophe arrives suddenly. In truth, it often announces itself quietly in advance. The back that stiffens every morning. The breath that shortens on stairs you once climbed without noticing. The persistent heaviness in your chest when you are alone with your thoughts. These are not inconveniences. They are communications. Ignoring them does not make you resilient. It makes you temporarily comfortable. There is a difference. The fourth truth is intertwined with this one. You have confused being busy with being purposeful. Somewhere along the way, modern life turned constant activity into a moral virtue. If you are exhausted, you must be important. If your schedule is full, your life must be meaningful. I believed this for decades. I filled my calendar so completely that silence began to feel like failure. Yet when I look back now, I can see how many of those crowded days were simply elaborate avoidance. Avoidance of difficult conversations. Avoidance of sitting still long enough to hear my own dissatisfaction. Avoidance of recognizing that achievement without presence is a hollow kind of success. I remember a winter evening when my son was 14. He was sitting at the kitchen table attempting homework that neither of us truly understood. I was reviewing case files for the next day, convinced that diligence in my profession justified absence at home. He asked me a question. I answered without looking up. He asked another. I told him I was busy. He stopped asking. It was a small moment. There were thousands like it, individually insignificant, collectively decisive. People imagine that relationships fracture through dramatic betrayals. More often, they erode through accumulated inattention. Through evenings when you are physically present but psychologically elsewhere. Through the quiet message you send when productivity repeatedly outranks connection. I am not saying you must abandon ambition. I am saying you must decide consciously and repeatedly what you are willing to sacrifice in its pursuit. The fifth truth concerns forgiveness, and it is one that took me an embarrassingly long time to understand. We are taught to think of forgiveness as a noble gift we bestow upon someone who has wronged us. In reality, it is a form of internal housekeeping. Resentment is heavy. It occupies mental space that could be used for curiosity, creativity, or simple peace. For years, I carried a grievance against a colleague who undermined my work in a public and humiliating way. I replayed the incident in my mind with astonishing dedication. I refined my imaginary rebuttals. I nurtured indignation as though it were evidence of integrity. Meanwhile, she continued her life largely unaffected by my private bitterness. One day, while walking through a park in early autumn, I realized I had spent more emotional energy hating that moment than I had spent celebrating dozens of genuinely joyful ones. Forgiveness did not mean approving of what happened. It meant deciding that I was no longer willing to pay ongoing rent for a memory that could not be altered. There is a peculiar liberation in releasing the belief that your suffering honors the seriousness of the offense. Sometimes it simply prolongs it. The sixth truth is perhaps the most liberating of all, though it rarely feels that way at first. The future you are waiting for, the one where everything is finally in order, is largely imaginary. I have lived through wars, economic downturns, technological revolutions, personal triumphs, and devastating losses. Each era promised that stability was just around the corner. Each era delivered a new configuration of uncertainty instead. Human beings are remarkably consistent in postponing joy. We tell ourselves that once the children are older, once the debt is reduced, once the career is secure, once the diagnosis is clearer, once the house is paid off, then we will allow ourselves to live more fully. The problem is that life does not operate on a single-issue timeline. Solving one difficulty simply reveals the next. When I read through old notebooks now, I see a younger version of myself perpetually preparing for a future in which she would finally feel ready. Ready to travel, ready to write, ready to speak honestly, ready to rest. Decades passed in preparation for a life that was already happening. This realization is not meant to depress you, it is meant to free you. If perfection is not forthcoming, participation becomes the only reasonable choice. The seventh truth may unsettle you because it unsettled me. Many of your strongest convictions are inherited rather than examined. We absorb beliefs from families, communities, cultures, and institutions long before we develop the intellectual tools to evaluate them. By the time we are capable of questioning them, they feel indistinguishable from personal insight. I spent years guiding students toward paths that seemed sensible according to the standards of the world I grew up in. Practical careers were praised. Creative risks were politely discouraged. Security was treated as synonymous with fulfillment. Only much later did I recognize how often my advice reflected unconscious assumptions rather than genuine understanding of the individual sitting in front of me. One former student returned decades later to tell me he had eventually abandoned the stable profession I encouraged him to pursue. He was now teaching literature, visibly animated in a way I had never seen during his youth. He was gracious. He thanked me for caring. But I left that conversation aware that caring is not always the same as seeing. Sometimes it is filtered through the lens of our own unchallenged fears. To live consciously, you must occasionally ask yourself an uncomfortable question. Would I believe this if I had been born somewhere else? The answer can be destabilizing. It can also be transformative. These 7 truths alone could occupy a lifetime of reflection, yet life does not grant us the convenience of mastering one lesson before introducing another. It unfolds as a complex, overlapping curriculum. What matters is not achieving flawless understanding. What matters is maintaining a willingness to revise your assumptions while time still permits revision. At 101, I am less interested in being right than in being awake. That distinction has become the quiet center of my peace. The 8th truth is one most people avoid thinking about until life forces the conversation. You are going to lose more than you currently imagine, and you are not as emotionally prepared as you believe. I do not say this to frighten you. Fear is rarely a useful teacher. I say it because there is a strange kindness in realism. In your 40s and 50s, life still feels structurally stable. Your identity is familiar. Your routines are predictable. Even when difficulties arise, you still feel fundamentally in control. It is easy during these years to assume that the general pattern will continue indefinitely. You begin to think of loss as an occasional interruption rather than an inevitable companion. Then, quietly at first, the rhythm changes. Friends begin to receive diagnoses. Parents become fragile in ways that feel surreal. People who once anchored your sense of continuity disappear from ordinary days and exist only in photographs, voicemail recordings, recipes written in handwriting you suddenly realize you will never see again. I remember attending 3 funerals in one single spring. The weather was beautiful. That felt almost offensive. The trees were flowering while entire histories were ending. I realized during those months that grief does not always arrive as a dramatic storm. Sometimes it is a slow rearrangement of your internal landscape. Familiar emotional landmarks vanish. You wake up one morning and understand that you are living in a quieter, lonelier country than the one you remember. What makes this truth difficult is not simply the fact of loss. It is the illusion we maintain that we will somehow be ready when it comes. Readiness suggests rehearsal. But how do you rehearse the absence of someone whose presence has shaped your daily existence for decades? You cannot. What you can do is practice appreciation while they are still here, not as a sentimental exercise, but as a discipline. When my closest friend Margaret became ill in her 70s, we began meeting every Thursday afternoon for tea. At first, it was a gesture of support. Over time, it became a ritual of witnessing. We spoke about ordinary things, grocery prices, books we half finished, the strange fashions of younger generations. Yet beneath those conversations was a shared understanding that time had shifted from abstract to immediate. When she died, I was devastated. But I was also grateful for those deliberate afternoons. They had allowed us to say goodbye in small, gentle installments rather than in one unbearable moment. The ninth truth is subtler but equally revealing. The way you treat people who cannot advance your ambitions is a remarkably accurate measure of who you are. Almost everyone can display charm toward authority. Courtesy toward those with power is often strategic rather than sincere. Character is more visible in the sideways and downward directions of daily life. I learned this lesson through a painful memory. In my 60s, I supervised a young administrative assistant who struggled with efficiency. She misplaced documents. She asked repetitive questions. I was under considerable pressure at the time, and I justified my impatience as professional necessity. I spoke sharply to her more than once. Nothing dramatic. Just small dismissive tones that accumulated like dust. Years later, I discovered that she had left the position partly because she felt perpetually inadequate. She believed she had disappointed me. When I heard this, I felt a deep, delayed shame. I had dedicated my career to helping young people build confidence. Yet in the quiet corners of my own workplace, I had contributed to someone's self-doubt simply because it was inconvenient to be kinder. This truth is not about condemning yourself for every moment of irritability. We are all human. We become tired. We become preoccupied. It is about recognizing that these moments are diagnostic. They reveal your default settings when no reward is offered for goodness. If you wish to understand your values, observe your behavior in situations where politeness is optional. The 10th truth is the one that sits closest to my heart. The love you assume others understand is not always as clearly communicated as you think. We demonstrate affection through habits, through loyalty, through shared routines that become so ordinary they almost disappear from conscious awareness. Yet spoken love has a unique power. Words mark moments in ways that gestures sometimes cannot. My husband and I were married for more than 6 decades. We built a life composed largely of practical acts, paying bills, tending gardens, raising children, navigating illnesses, celebrating modest successes. I believed, with good reason, that he knew he was loved. But after he died, I found myself replaying countless ordinary evenings in which I had felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for his steady presence and had chosen silence because it seemed unnecessary to say what was already evident. Grief is complex. It is not only the pain of absence, it is also the ache of unfinished sentences. The awareness that certain affirmations can no longer be delivered to their intended recipient. I do not torment myself with regret. That would be another form of wasted energy. But I do wish I had spoken more freely while time was generous. So I tell you this now with gentle urgency. Do not assume that consistency of action automatically translates into clarity of feeling. Tell people you love them. Tell them you are proud of them. Tell them they matter. Not in a dramatic farewell speech, but in the middle of an unremarkable afternoon when the world is neither ending nor beginning. The ordinary day is the most reliable stage life offers. There is an additional layer to this truth that often goes unmentioned. Expressing love also clarifies it for yourself. When you articulate affection, you are not merely informing the other person. You are reinforcing your own awareness of what is meaningful. You are training your attention toward connection rather than distraction. As you grow older, you begin to understand that time is less like a river and more like a series of rooms you pass through. Some rooms are brightly lit and filled with conversation. Others are dim and echoing. Eventually, you reach a space where you can look back through open doorways and see the continuity of your own becoming. In that space, the moments that glow most vividly are rarely the ones society taught you to prioritize. They are the quiet exchanges of care, the afternoons you chose presence over productivity, the simple declarations of love that required no audience. Loss will still come. Misunderstandings will still occur. No amount of wisdom prevents the fundamental vulnerability of being human. Yet awareness can soften the harshest edges. It can transform regret into guidance for the years that remain. At 101, I do not claim mastery of these truths. I claim familiarity. I have lived with them long enough to recognize their contours in almost every life story I encounter. And if there is any gift in longevity, it is the ability to see patterns clearly enough to speak about them without pretense. What you choose to do with that clarity is entirely your decision. So here we are at the quiet end of these reflections. 10 hard truths, not dramatic revelations, not philosophical riddles meant to impress you, just observations gathered slowly across a century of living, loving, losing, misunderstanding, learning, and beginning again more times than I can neatly count. If there is one final thing I want you to understand, it is this. Wisdom does not usually arrive as a sudden awakening. It accumulates like light at dawn, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize you can see further than you once could. These truths are not instructions for building a perfect life. They are invitations to live a conscious one. At 101, perfection has lost all its appeal. Control, too, has revealed itself as a fragile illusion. What remains meaningful is attention. Attention to your health before crisis demands it. Attention to your relationships before silence hardens into distance. Attention to your beliefs before they quietly shape decades of decisions you never consciously made. You may be listening to me now while multitasking, half present, already thinking about what comes next in your day. I understand. Life is full. Responsibilities do not pause simply because an old woman is speaking honestly about what she has seen. But perhaps later, when you find a moment alone, in a car, in a kitchen, at night, in the stillness just before sleep, you might let one of these truths settle more deeply, not as a burden, but as a gentle recalibration. You still have time. That is the extraordinary privilege of being younger than 101. Time to make the appointment you have postponed. Time to speak the words you have rehearsed only in your thoughts. Time to forgive someone who continues to occupy far too much space in your inner world. Time to question an assumption that has quietly limited your courage. Most importantly, you have time to choose presence over postponement. The future will always present new complications. Waiting for life to become simple before you begin living it fully is a promise that experience rarely keeps. Begin within the imperfect circumstances you already inhabit. That is where authenticity grows. I do not know what your specific path will look like. No one ever truly does. But I know this with a clarity that has been earned slowly and sometimes painfully. The quality of your life will be shaped less by what happens to you and more by how honestly you are willing to engage with what happens. Denial offers temporary comfort. Awareness offers lasting freedom. One day, if you are fortunate enough to reach an age where memory stretches farther behind you than imagination stretches ahead, you will sit quietly and review the rooms of your own life. I hope you will find more moments of courage than hesitation, more expressions of love than polite restraint, more genuine participation than careful delay. That hope is why I have spoken, not to instruct you, but to accompany you briefly with the perspective of someone who has walked a very long road. If even one of these reflections helps you step forward with greater clarity, then this conversation between generations will have been worthwhile. Take care of your days. They are far more precious than they appear while you are busy living them.